I'm just here to pick up this watch. Sir, your ID, please.
I already gave it to you. Police, hands up, put him on the floor. What's going on? I haven't done anything. Don't move!
A black man walked into Voss and Sterling Jewelers on Hargrove Avenue, one of the most exclusive jewelry stores in Charleston, South Carolina. He had been there before, in his mind. He'd researched the piece for 3 weeks, knew the exact case it sat in, and came prepared to spend $18,500 on his wife's 27th anniversary gift. He walked to the counter, asked one precise question about the setting, and placed his platinum card on the glass. The associate looked at the card. She looked at him. She looked at the card again. Then she picked up the phone, without touching the terminal once. Within 11 minutes, a tattooed off-duty officer had both hands on the collar of a retired Special Forces general. A second officer was closing in from the right. A woman near the entrance had her hand over her mouth. And a man in a blue shirt at the far end of the counter had already raised his phone. The camera on the ceiling, CM01, was recording everything. Nobody in that store knew what that card had paid for. Nobody knew what that man had survived. Nobody thought to ask. They were about to find out. Before we dive deeper into this incredible story, let me know in the comment where you're watching from tonight. And if you haven't already, please hit the subscribe button, because what unfolds over the next several minutes will leave you speechless. Trust me, you wouldn't want to miss it. Nobody who saw Alistair Vance on the street would have known. That was, in many ways, the entire point. He carried himself the way men do when they have spent decades learning to disappear. Shoulders level, eyes steady, nothing wasted. He didn't walk into rooms announcing himself. He didn't need to. At 61, he was broad through the chest and unhurried in his movements. The kind of physical stillness that people mistake for calm, but is actually something closer to readiness. He wore a leather jacket that morning, khaki trousers, a plain watch. Nothing about him said anything, which for 32 years had been a professional requirement. He enlisted at 19, not out of desperation, not out of lack of options, but out of something far more deliberate, a need to be tested at the highest possible level. He found that level quickly. By 23, he had been selected for Special Forces, passing a screening process that eliminated more than 80% of candidates. He never spoke about what that selection involved. He never spoke about most things. What followed those first years cannot be fully reconstructed from any public record, because most of it does not exist in any public record. Eastern Europe in the 90s, when borders were dissolving and new dangers were filling the gaps. North Africa in the early 2000s, during a period when the United States government was conducting operations it would not acknowledge for another decade. The Horn of Africa, multiple rotations, multiple objectives, none of them the kind that come with press releases or parades. Alistair Vance spent the better part of 3 decades in places that official maps don't mark with the names that appear in classified briefings. He moved through those places with small teams, sometimes with no team at all, doing the work that protects a country without ever receiving its thanks in any form the country could see. He received 3 presidential commendations. 2 were presented in ceremonies that were not photographed. 1 was delivered in an envelope through a chain of intermediaries so long that by the time it reached him, he had already moved on to the next assignment. He received 1 Medal of Valor, the classification level of which meant that the citation lived in a file that required a specific security clearance just to locate. He never displayed it. It sat in a box in the study of his Charleston home, in a drawer beneath other papers. He retired with the rank of general after 32 years of service. Not with fanfare, not with a ceremony that made the news. He simply stopped. He came home to Eleanor, the woman who had spent nearly 3 decades receiving phone calls that told her nothing and waiting for a husband who could explain even less. She had built a life anyway, raised their son Dominic, built a career of her own, maintained a household that felt like a home, even when the man whose name was on the mortgage was a continent away in a situation she was not clear to know about. When Alistair finally walked through the door for the last time in uniform, she didn't cry. She had already done that in private, years before, and decided it wasn't useful. She made dinner instead. He sat at the table and ate it. They didn't need to say anything. They had survived too much together for words to be the primary currency. Dominic was 24 now. He knew more than most. He had grown up watching his father in the particular way that children of silent men learn to read the spaces between words. He knew that the stillness his father carried wasn't peace. It was discipline. He knew that his father had been in rooms where the wrong decision cost lives, had made those decisions more times than he would ever discuss, and had carried the weight of them so quietly for so long that it had simply become part of his posture. Dominic was proud of his father in a way that had no clean expression, the kind of pride that sits at the bottom of the chest like ballast. By the time Alistair Vance walked into Voss and Sterling that Tuesday morning, he had been retired for 4 years. He had, by any measure that exists, earned the right to walk into any store in any city in this country and make a purchase without incident. He had earned it in a currency most people will never be asked to spend. He had bled for it, been separated from his family for it, watched men he trained come home in flag-draped boxes for it. He had protected things, institutions, officials, operations, that the people inside those jewelry display cases would never know existed. None of that was visible when he walked in. What was visible was a black man in a leather jacket. And in the small, carpeted world of Voss and Sterling Jewelers, where the cases gleamed under recessed lighting and the staff had been trained to read a customer's value in the first 4 seconds, that was apparently all the information anyone needed. It was the oldest equation in America. The most expensive one, too. They just didn't know yet who was about to send them the bill. He walked in at 10:30 a.m. The door to Voss and Sterling was heavy, the kind of door designed to communicate something before you ever reach the merchandise. Dark wood frame, brushed brass handle, a subtle resistance on the pull that said this is not a place you wander into. Alistair Vance pulled it open without breaking stride and stepped into the cool, hushed interior the way he had stepped into 100 controlled environments before it. He paused for exactly 1 second, oriented himself, and moved toward the second case on the left. He already knew where it was. He had spent 3 evenings on the store's website, cross-referencing with 2 independent gemologist reviews and a conversation with Eleanor's sister, who had once overheard Eleanor describe, in passing, the exact type of setting she found beautiful. A platinum band, emerald cut, a stone with clarity over size. Eleanor had never been interested in spectacle for its own sake. He had found the piece, noted the case number in the store's virtual catalog, and confirmed it was still in stock the morning before he drove over. He was not browsing. He was completing a mission with the same methodology he had applied to every other objective in his adult life. Sloane Whitaker approached him from behind the counter with the practiced glide of someone trained to assess before they smile. She was blonde, mid-30s, with the particular polish of a person who had worked luxury retail long enough to sort customers by appearance before they opened their mouths. She smiled at Vance. It arrived on her face correctly. Teeth, eyes, the slight tilt of the head, but it didn't stay. Something moved underneath it, quick and small, there and gone. A flicker. Vance didn't miss it. He had spent his career reading rooms and reading faces in environments where misreading either could end a mission or end a life. He filed it away and said nothing. He asked about the piece in the second case. He used the correct terminology, asked about the depth percentage, the girdle thickness, whether the pavilion cut was modified or standard. He asked about the provenance of the platinum, the tension of the prong setting, whether the band could be resized without compromising the integrity of the mount. These were not the questions Sloane Whitaker was accustomed to fielding from the customers she had quietly categorized him as. Her smile recalibrated. Her posture did something small and involuntary, a slight backward shift, a repositioning of her hands on the counter. She answered his questions. She answered them correctly, because she knew her inventory. But she answered them the way a person does when the conversation is not going the direction they expected, and they're deciding in real time what to do about that. The call started around the 10-minute mark. The first one was brief. She turned slightly away from the counter, kept her voice low, cupped the phone against her collarbone. Vance was looking at the piece she had removed from the case, holding it up to the light the way Eleanor would, examining the way the stone distributed the overhead glow. He did not look at Sloane. He did not need to. He could hear the shape of the call without hearing the words. Vivian St. Clair emerged from the back office at 10:41. She was the store manager, late 40s, dark hair pulled back precisely, the kind of professional composure that had been assembled over years of managing high-end retail and had, somewhere along the way, calcified into something less flexible than composure. She came to stand at the far end of the counter at an angle that was designed to look casual, and was not. Her eyes moved over Alistair Vance with the systematic efficiency of an inventory check. She said nothing. She simply stood there, present in the way that authority makes itself present when it wants to be felt without being confrontational. Not yet. At the far end of the counter, 11 feet from where Vance stood, a man in a blue shirt looked up. Commander Arthur Sterling had come in that morning with no particular urgency. His wife's birthday was in 2 weeks. He had a short list. He had been working his way through the cases on the right side of the store with the easy patience of someone with no deadline and no suspicion that the next 11 minutes would become the most consequential 11 minutes of his week. He was off duty. He was just a man shopping for his wife. But Arthur Sterling had spent enough years in structured environments to recognize the choreography unfolding at the other end of the counter. The associates turned shoulder. The manager appearing from nowhere. The low phone calls. The surveillance posture that everyone except the man being surveilled was pretending wasn't happening. He had seen this before. Not in a jewelry store, but he had seen it. He reached into his shirt pocket. He found his phone. He did not make a production of it. He simply raised it, angled it toward the center of the room, and pressed record. The timestamp in the corner of his screen read 10:41 a.m. Alistair Vance was still holding the necklace up to the light, turning it slowly, thinking about Eleanor. He had no idea the room had already decided what he was. Sloane Whitaker placed the necklace back in the case. She did it without being asked, without explanation, with the smooth efficiency of someone executing a decision that had already been made somewhere above her pay grade. She closed the case. She looked at Vance. And then she said, with the careful neutrality of a person delivering a scripted line, that his card had been flagged, that the system was showing an issue, that she was sorry, but she couldn't process it. Vance looked at the terminal on the counter between them. It was dark. She had not touched it. She had not swiped the card, had not inserted it, had not tapped it against the reader, had not entered a single digit into any machine connected to any network that could have returned any result whatsoever. The card was sitting on the glass counter, exactly where he had placed it. The terminal had not been involved in this transaction at any point. And yet the system, she said, was showing an issue. He looked at the card. He looked at the terminal. He looked at Sloane Whitaker. He said nothing. He had approximately 2 seconds of that silence before Silas Thorne's hand closed around the back of his collar. Thorne came from the left, moving fast, the particular fast of someone who had already decided what this situation was before he entered the room. He was broad, tattooed across the forearm that was now bunched in the fabric of Vance's jacket, off-duty, but carrying himself with the full authority of the badge that was clipped to his belt. He said something, an instruction, a command, the words arriving sharp and loud in the quiet of the store. He didn't wait for compliance. The grip came first. The words were decoration. A second officer materialized from near the entrance within moments, younger, his hand already moving toward Vance's opposite shoulder, his face carrying the expression of a man who had arrived into a situation already framed for him and was simply filling his assigned role in it. The store went completely still. The woman near the entrance, a blonde in a dark blazer who had been examining earrings on the far left, took 2 steps backward and put her hand over her mouth. The junior associate behind the counter pressed herself against the back wall. Vivian St. Clair stood exactly where she had been standing, watching, her face arranged into the careful blankness of someone who had made a decision and was now waiting to see if it held. And Arthur Sterling kept recording. What happened next, or more precisely, what did not happen next, was the most tactically sophisticated thing Alistair Vance had done in 4 years of retirement. He did not move, not a flinch, not a shift of weight, not a turn of the head or a tensing of the jaw or a single muscular response to 2 men putting their hands on him in a public space without cause, without process, without a single verified fact to justify the contact. He stood in the grip of Officer Silas Thorne the way a mountain stands in weather, present, immovable, utterly unimpressed by the forces being applied to it. His breathing did not change. His hands remained visible. His expression did not collapse into fear and did not harden into defiance. It stayed level, neutral, waiting. This was not passivity. Anyone who had ever seen Alistair Vance work would have understood immediately that this was the opposite of passivity. This was a man with 3 decades of close-quarters training, making a precise, calculated decision in real time, assessing the room, identifying the recording device, understanding the legal architecture of what was being constructed around him, and choosing, with complete deliberateness, to let it be built. Because he understood something that Silas Thorne did not. The moment Vance moved, the story changed. The moment his hand came up, the footage became complicated. The moment his voice rose, there would be a competing narrative. He had spent his career in situations where the wrong reaction destroyed the mission. He was not going to destroy this one. He reached slowly into his interior jacket pocket. Thorne tightened his grip. The second officer stepped closer. The movement in Vance's pocket was deliberate, unhurried, nothing sudden about it. The movement of a man who had performed controlled actions under extreme physical pressure so many times that his hands had simply stopped being capable of panic. He produced his military ID. He held it up. He did not hold it toward Thorne, who was still gripping his collar. He did not hold it toward the second officer. He held it at a slight angle. Outward, toward the room, toward the counter, toward the precise corner of the space where a man in a blue shirt was holding a phone steady with the practice calm of someone who understood exactly what he was documenting. The card sat on the counter, untouched by any terminal. The ID was in the air, in frame, undeniable. Cam 01 was recording from above. Arthur Sterling was recording from 11 feet away. And Silas Thorne's hands were on the collar of a retired Special Forces general who had, at various points in his career, been shot at on 4 continents, and had never once lost his composure under fire. He wasn't going to lose it here. Not in a jewelry store. Not for this. The precinct smelled like burnt coffee and fluorescent light, the particular institutional staleness of a building that processed human problems all day and absorbed none of the weight of them. Vance sat in a chair on one side of the table. Thorne sat on the other. The handcuffs had been removed, a small, begrudging concession made somewhere between the store and the booking desk, and Vance had placed both hands flat on the table in front of him, palms down, fingers relaxed. He had been sitting in exactly that position for 22 minutes. He had not asked for water. He had not asked for a phone call. He had not said a single word. Thorne was still running on adrenaline, which was the only fuel that had been powering him since he first put his hands on a man he had decided was a problem before he had any evidence of a problem. He was working through the paperwork with the focused energy of someone building a case in real time, constructing the architecture of justification around a decision that had already been made in a jewelry store on Hargrove Avenue. He used the language correctly: probable cause, suspicious behavior, failure to comply. The bureaucratic vocabulary that transforms a man grabbing another man by the collar into a procedure. He was good at the paperwork. He had done it before. He had not yet looked up Alistair Vance. At the 40-minute mark, Vance spoke. Not loudly. Not with the heat of a man who had been waiting to release 40 minutes of compressed fury. He spoke the way he had given coordinates in the field. Clearly, precisely, without inflection, in the register of a man for whom words were tools and not performances. He gave his full name. He gave his rank. He gave his service number. 9 digits, delivered in the flat, unhurried cadence of someone who had recited them so many times they had become as automatic as a heartbeat. Then he stopped and waited. Thorne looked up from the paperwork. Something had shifted in the room. Not dramatically, not with any cinematic punctuation, but the way a room shifts when the temperature changes. He looked at the man across the table with a new kind of attention. Not respect, not yet anything that generous, but a recalibration, a first small loosening of certainty. He typed the name into the search bar. The results loaded in under 2 seconds. What came back was not a social media profile. It was not a local news mention or a community board listing or any of the ordinary digital footprints that ordinary people leave. What came back was the kind of search result that takes a moment to fully process, the kind where the brain moves through several items before it understands what it is looking at and then has to go back to the beginning and start again. A congressional testimony transcript from 2019, the name appearing in the subcommittee record of a closed session briefing on special operations oversight. A photograph, not recent, mid-career, of Vance in dress uniform standing beside a 4-star general at a Pentagon ceremony, both of them looking at something outside the frame with the shared gravity of men who had just come from a serious room. an acknowledgement in the published report of a federal anti-terrorism task force, the citation brief and formal, operational consultation provided by, and then the name, and then a second task force report, different year, same citation, and a third result that loaded and then, after a moment, redirected to a page that required a clearance level Silas Thorne did not have and would never have. The color did not drain from his face all at once. It went in stages, the way light leaves a room at dusk, gradually, then completely. His hand, still resting on the keyboard, stopped moving. The paperwork on the table between them suddenly looked like what it was: a document being built by a man who had made a catastrophic error and had not yet fully understood the dimensions of it. His phone buzzed. He looked at it. Vivian St. Clair, or someone calling from the store's registered number, was calling the precinct's front desk, clarifying, walking it back, using the word misunderstanding in the careful way that people use it when what they mean is we need to contain this before it becomes what it already is. It was already what it already was. Arthur Sterling's video had left his phone within 20 minutes of the incident. He had sent it to a journalist he knew personally, to a civil rights attorney whose number he had saved for reasons he had never expected to use, and to a third contact whose reach on social media was the kind that turns a local story into a national story before the evening news has time to pick it up. The video was clean, steady, unambiguous. It showed a man holding a military ID being gripped by the collar in a jewelry store. It showed a credit card sitting on a counter, untouched. It showed a timestamp. It showed everything. Silas Thorne looked across the table at Alistair Vance, who had not moved, whose hands were still flat on the table, whose expression had not changed by a single degree through any of it. He had nothing left to build the paperwork with. And, somewhere in the city, 3 journalists had already started writing. The termination paperwork for Silas Thorne was processed within 72 hours. It did not take long because the case against him was not complicated. The video was 4 minutes and 17 seconds of uncomplicated evidence. A man with a badge and no warrant, no verified complaint, and no legal basis, putting his hands on another man in a retail establishment while a credit card sat untouched on a glass counter. There was no competing narrative that survived contact with the footage. The union made the procedural motions it was obligated to make, filed the language it was required to file, and then quietly stepped back from a situation that had already been decided by a camera phone in the hands of a man in a blue shirt. Thorne's badge and his service weapon were collected. His access was revoked. He was escorted out of a building he had worked in for 9 years and did not come back. Sloan Whitaker was dismissed 3 days after that. Her termination letter cited a violation of the store's customer service protocols. The careful, legal phrasing that companies use when what they mean is something they do not want to state plainly in a document that may later be subpoenaed. She did not contest it publicly. She had seen the video. She understood what the video showed. Vivian St. Clair resigned under pressure at the end of the same week, submitting a letter that described her departure as a personal decision made after careful reflection. Nobody who had been in that store on a Tuesday morning believed that, and nobody was required to pretend otherwise. The federal civil rights inquiry arrived shortly after. A formal investigation into the store's practices, its staff training, its incident history, the patterns that tend to precede the kind of event that ends up documented on a ceiling camera at 10:41 a.m. That investigation would take months. It would produce findings. It would cost the ownership group considerably more than the inquiry itself. None of it was the main event. Marcus Webb had served as a JAG officer for 11 years before he left the military and entered private practice. He had served 3 of those years under the direct command of Alistair Vance, in circumstances that had given him a precise and lasting understanding of exactly who Alistair Vance was. When Vance called him from the precinct, the one phone call he had been entitled to and had waited nearly an hour to make, Webb did not ask many questions. He asked 3. He listened to the answers, and then he told Vance he would be there within the hour, and he was. The lawsuit was filed 29 days after the incident. It named Silas Thorne, the store, the ownership group, and the municipality. It was precise, methodical, and built with the same attention to documentation that Vance had applied to every operation he had ever run. Every piece of evidence cataloged, every timeline verified, every gap in the opposing account identified and loaded. Webb did not litigate loudly. He litigated the way his former commanding officer had spent 32 years operating, quietly, thoroughly, and without giving the other side anything they could use. The settlement came 14 months later, $5.4 million. No admission of liability in the legal text, because there never is. But the number said everything the text was not required to say. It said it clearly, in the language that institutions understand better than any other, the language of consequence, delivered in the form of a check that required several signatures and a very long silence in the room where it was authorized. Vance gave a portion of it to a legal defense fund for civil rights cases in South Carolina. He did not hold a press conference about it. He did not post about it. He told Dominic, who told no one. Eleanor found out the way she found out most things about her husband. Not from him directly, but from the shape of his stillness afterward, which was different from the stillness before. Lighter, somehow, as if something that had been held at tension for 14 months had finally been set down. They went back on a Thursday morning in March, 14 months and 11 days after the original visit. The store had new management, new staff, new ownership in practice, if not entirely on paper. The display cases were the same. The lighting was the same. The second case on the left was the same. The piece was still there. Webb had confirmed it quietly, through a phone call to the new manager, who had been briefed on the history of the space she now ran and understood, without needing it explained, the significance of what was about to happen. Eleanor had never seen it before. She had never known it existed, had never known that her husband had spent 3 evenings researching it, had never known it had been waiting in a case for over a year while the world slowly rearranged itself around the question of whether he had the right to buy it. She saw it now. Vance placed the platinum card on the counter. The associate picked it up. She swiped it. The terminal lit green in under 4 seconds. Eleanor put her hand over her mouth. Not in shock, the way the woman near the entrance had done 14 months ago, but in the way of someone receiving something they had not known they were waiting for. The receipt printed. Vance folded it once and put it in his jacket pocket. It was just a receipt. That was the whole point.